Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session, Volunteer Engagement in the Digital Settlement Context. I'm very happy to have you join us today. My name is Andrew Lushtik. I'm one of Together Project's co-directors and co-founders, where I lead our program development and delivery. Today, I'm going to be chairing our session, and I'll also be having a little bit of a session as well at the very end to kind of sum up some of the thoughts from our other speakers. I also just wanted to start by saying thank you to everyone at Pathways to Prosperity for giving us this opportunity to present. And once again, thank you so much for joining us for today's session. I will just start with kind of going through our agenda, and I'll also introduce some of our speakers, who of course will introduce themselves in more detail when the time comes. We're going to be starting with Anna Hill, who is my co-director at Together Project, and she serves as our management lead. She's going to be talking to us about volunteering with refugees and refugee claimants in the digital settlement context. Natasha Camo is Together Project's Program and Communications Coordinator. She's going to be talking to us about centering newcomer voices in the digital settlement context. And Mirna El Sabak is currently the General Manager of Stakeholder Engagement at Costi Immigrant Services, and she works closely with us at Together Project to identify and refer clients to our Welcome Group program. She's going to be giving us a perspective from within the settlement sector itself. Her session is called Building Refugee Newcomer Women's Digital Literacy in the Digital Settlement Context. And then finally, I will wrap things up and hopefully do so in a coherent way and talk a little bit about where do we go from here. Talk about the lessons learned and potential pathways to improved integration outcomes for refugee newcomers. So without further ado, I will turn it over to my colleague, Anna Hill, to get us started.
Okay, thanks so much, Andrew. So again, my name is Anna Hill, and I'm a co-director at Together Project, a charitable initiative of Make Way. Together Project was founded in 2016 in the Greater Toronto Area, and our mission is to connect refugee newcomers with Canadians to build stronger, more integrated communities. And we do this primarily through our Welcome Group program, which matches a group of volunteers with a government-assisted refugee claimant, or protected person for 6 months of social and integration support. So in terms of our intended impact, so we're building newcomer social connections, both to mitigate social isolation and also to help newcomers increase their social networks. We survey each newcomer household prior to their match to identify the household's unique integration priorities. This might include language learning or finding a job or access to education or healthcare or childcare. And then we work to match the newcomer household with a group of volunteers who have a complementary set of skills and experiences. And we call this process preference matching. And although we think of newcomers really as our primary beneficiaries, we also really consider volunteers to be a secondary beneficiary, in that many of our volunteers are learning a great deal about the barriers that newcomers may face, and they're trained to play an active role in building more welcoming communities. These are some kind of key features of our Welcome Group program. One thing that Mirna can talk a bit more about, we work very closely with our settlement agency partners to ensure that we're complementing but not duplicating settlement services. All of our volunteers are receiving a vulnerable sector screening, training, and support throughout their matches. And for our government-assisted refugee matches in particular, there's also a strong connection to an agency caseworker between the Welcome Group lead and the agency caseworker. And our agency partners are involved in our work by both referring the newcomers to the program, but also they assist with volunteer training. And certainly if problems arise in the match that require professional settlement support, we're working closely with the caseworker to address that type of problem. There's some other kind of features of the Welcome Group program here on screen, and if you have any specific questions later, we're happy to talk more about the program itself. In terms of transitioning our program to online delivery in response to the pandemic, I think it's important to note that, when we began from 2017 to March of 2020, we were primarily delivering the Welcome Group program in person, but there was always this online element in that we connected volunteers and newcomers over a digital messaging platform, typically WhatsApp. But once the pandemic hit, we really had to figure out how to move everything onto online program delivery. So this was all our existing matches and our new matches. And we called this new model remote social support. So to kind of learn a bit more about who our audience is and any experiences that the audience has had with online volunteering with newcomers, I'm just going to encourage Andrew to go ahead and launch our poll questions. And then we'll kind of hopefully hear a bit more from Andrew about what we've learned from the audience and your experiences with online community engagement with newcomers towards the end of the talk. So in terms of, just some preliminary findings, we've definitely observed that there are some newcomer groups like single mothers or newcomers with higher language skills and higher digital literacy that have been adapting very well to online volunteering. But there are also some newcomers, particularly with lower language skills and who may not have access to technology or a lot of digital literacy training, who can struggle to form social connections online and to make progress with their integration priorities. So it's a good fit for some, but less of a good fit for others. Just in terms of how people have been connecting remotely. There's many different ways that newcomers and volunteers are connecting, but some kind of common examples are newcomers and volunteers meeting to practice English, newcomers and volunteers meeting to support children with doing homework. Also, there are, book clubs, there are also, games nights. So there's kind of a variety of different ways that newcomers and volunteers have adapted to provide social support over online platforms. So I think over the course of the first 6 months of the pandemic, we worked very closely with our volunteers to try to adapt the volunteer role so that it could be as effective and efficient in providing volunteer support. And so some kind of examples of changes that we made is that in-person matches had previously been meeting a couple times a month, maybe at a newcomer's home, but instead we really encourage volunteers to set up a regular weekly online meeting. And we found that this kind of consistent, regular contact allowed newcomers and volunteers to kind of form build trust over an online platform. Next. As well, we really had to adapt the volunteer onboarding process. I've talked a little bit about how we were offering our training online, doing the volunteer interviews online. But another sort of challenge of online volunteering is that we were not only introducing newcomers and volunteers to each other, but as well, there are 4+ members in a match, and all of these volunteers had to kind of meet each other for the first time. And so it's been important to provide a lot of staff support in helping welcome groups figure out kind of the best role for each member of the match. So in terms of who our volunteers are, I think one thing that's kind of significant to note is that about 70% of our volunteers are under the age of 35. And this is kind of interesting in the sense that we feel like we're, really giving people an opportunity kind of in the early phases of their career to play an active role in building welcoming communities. And hopefully, this may mean that later on, they're more likely to support welcoming communities in the future. As well, we're also receiving a lot of support from corporate partners like TD Bank, who are interested in engaging volunteer teams. And for refugee newcomers, especially those who've arrived with higher language levels and strong professional backgrounds, these corporate volunteer teams can just really provide very, very meaningful support. As well, I just want to flag that about 50% of our volunteers have their own lived newcomer experience. And while this may not be a refugee newcomer experience, I think many of our volunteers do have their own experience facing different integration barriers, and they really bring that personal history into the support that they're providing. As well, we're looking to a lot of our newcomer volunteers to provide interpretation and to act as kind of a cultural bridge for the matches. In terms of advantages that we've heard from volunteers about, what's working well in remote social support and for whom, I think definitely there's a convenience factor. We've actually been able to increase the number of matches that we can make because it's more efficient for staff to be working online. I think for a lot of volunteers as well, there's a convenience factor. And then I would say among some newcomers, I think, again, single moms come to mind. They may feel a bit more comfortable with an online match and it may feel more feasible. Also in a big city like Toronto, geographic proximity is not a key factor in matching newcomers and volunteers. So this is sort of another advantage of online volunteering, but of course there are disadvantages as well. So in terms of some of the limits, I think a key one is that, there's just a lack of a sense of personal connection in some matches that are only connecting online. And as the pandemic restrictions have eased, we've heard from volunteers about how meaningful it has been to again start connecting in person. I think there's also been some real frustration with either a lack of access to technology or challenges, just with digital literacy. And then I think in terms of socializing, it's just a little bit less spontaneous and there's fewer ways to connect. It's hard to share a meal online. I think, just concluding, as the settlement sector is moving towards these new models of hybrid and digital program delivery, I think, the risk of newcomer social isolation is something that we really have to keep a close eye on. I think we've heard from many newcomers that they just can't wait to be able to attend in-person language classes because, again, this is a key opportunity to meet people. So I think as well, just continuing to work to find ways to build newcomer social connections. I think whether online or in person, it's just going to be a really important factor in whether or not, sort of within the digital settlement context, this new kind of move to online program delivery can be a success. And I think maybe just a final thing to say is that as the as we move toward digital settlement, I think the importance of really building newcomer digital literacy cannot be overemphasized. I think, if people don't have easy access to a computer or if they can't afford the internet, they simply can't take advantage of all the programs and resources that theoretically should be available at their fingertips. So to kind of let my colleague Natasha continue on this theme, I'm now going to just pass it off to her to share kind of what we're hearing from newcomers about some of the successes and challenges of volunteer engagement in the digital settlement context.
I'm just going to butt in for one more second, just to remind people that we do have the poll in the top right that you can click. And for questions, if you have questions about any of our presenters' sessions, you can just drop them into the Q&A section and we can collect them at the end for a bit of a Q&A session as well. I will now go over to Natasha's session. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Anna and Andrew. So as Anna said, my session is about how newcomers are responding to our work in doing digital settlement, and not within the digital settlement context. And my name is Natasha. I am the Program and Communications Coordinator. Andrew, we can, next slide, thanks. So in terms of what this means, centering newcomer voices has been kind of the goal of Together Project for the last year or so. We wanted to make sure that our communications and everything we're putting out about our project is really focusing on the newcomers themselves, as they are the beneficiaries of our program. But as Anna showed, they also are a lot of the volunteers engaged with our program as well. And we wanted to really focus on how the volunteers are assisting with newcomer integration. So in order to do this, we've been using our social media, our website, our blog, and our podcast series to share stories and hand the mic over to newcomers to really talk about their own journey in settling in Canada. At the beginning of the year, we set out some communication goals for ourselves, and the three main ones were to, first of all, promote that we were able to be doing remote social support. So during the pandemic, as Anna said, we shifted our volunteer program to be working entirely remotely, doing video chats and phone calls with newcomers, and we wanted to promote this and show that this was happening, so that way volunteers could sign up and people would know that our program was still operating during the pandemic and helping combat some social isolation that was happening during the pandemic. The second goal was to promote public positive attitudes towards refugee newcomers. So trying to combat some of the stereotypes, negative stereotypes around newcomers, and instead show some positive storytelling and good news stories about what newcomers were contributing to the Canadian society, what sort of obstacles they were overcoming, and opportunities that they were afforded in Canada. Our third goal for communications was to increase understanding of what these challenges actually are. So showing that the settlement journey is complex and lengthy, and some of the things that newcomers have to overcome to really feel settled and have success in this country can be quite large obstacles. Things like learning a whole new language, finding a job during the pandemic, transferring credits from different education systems, and also making friends, like finding people that you can connect with. And we wanted to show that some of these challenges are mitigated through the program, the Welcome Group program that we have set up. So in order to achieve some of these goals, we started the program centering newcomer voices within our communications. This was to, as I said, promote newcomer storytelling, as well as the autonomy of newcomers to tell their own stories. So making sure we highlight both the challenges that they're facing, but also the opportunities that are available within the settlement sector. So not only Together Project, but other organizations that have great training opportunities and classes that newcomers can take advantage of. We also wanted to emphasize the resilience of the newcomer community to overcome many different barriers and succeed. And finally, we wanted to allow space for vulnerable populations to reach larger audiences through our platform. So recognizing that many newcomers have a story to tell and great advice to share about their own experience, but they may not have the platform to do so. So we'd like to offer our platform as a place where they can reach larger audiences and audiences that care about these issues because they're, following us on whether that's social media or our website. So in the spring of 2021, so we did a series of focus groups. So we did 3 focus groups, all with newcomers. And those newcomers were both within our program, so newcomers that had benefited from the Welcome Group program, volunteers that had newcomer experience, as well as newcomer advocates outside of Together Project who could tell us how they thought we were doing from an outsider's perspective. These people all volunteered their time to, give us some feedback. They took the time ahead of the session to review some communications material we provided them. And then they joined the session and they answered some of our questions. So in this box, you'll see the slides that we used during the focus group. And some of the things we were asking them were, what sort of organizations have you seen that are doing a good job? Which form of social media do you think is the best way to get stories out there? What can we improve about what we're already doing, and things like that. Out of the focus groups, the main takeaway is that generally the newcomers think that we're doing a pretty good job with our communications. They enjoy our branding and that it's bright and colorful and really highlights success stories of newcomers. They liked that we're providing storytelling opportunities, that we share statistics and infographics, and that they think our platform is a good place to house newcomer experiences. And they also had some suggestions for us. So some of the suggestions that came out of the sessions were to pursue more press opportunities to reach an even broader audience outside of Together Project's own following, to share more content with newcomers directly. So some of the newcomers, for instance, in the focus groups, perhaps didn't know we had a podcast, so they thought we could do a better job of reaching them more directly through our volunteers. To host newcomer guest speakers or hand over our blog to newcomers to give them even more autonomy to speak for themselves. And to feature a newcomer family or individual over the course of their match to share progress from the beginning, when they're first matched, the middle, how is it going, and at the end, what has been achieved. And finally, to share more news articles about the broader refugee settlement experience globally. So providing some context for why newcomers may become refugees, why they may choose to come to Canada, and ultimately combating some of that misinformation that exists about refugees and negative stereotypes, like I mentioned earlier. So we took those suggestions and we've actually started 2 new initiatives. The first is guest blog posts. So newcomers have volunteered their time to share their stories through our blog. So the first one we did was with a volunteer, Fatma. She is herself a newcomer from Syria, and she wrote a really lovely piece about what it was like to come to Canada, some of the initial challenges she and her son faced, like learning English from scratch, and how there were Canadian volunteers who helped her and her son out. And ultimately how she decided that she wanted to give back to the community and help out other newcomers through the Together Project Welcome Group program, which is what she's doing now. And so she wrote that all herself, and we just kind of gave her the platform to do that. The second initiative we've started is called Story of a Match. So we are right now featuring Aya, who's a newcomer from Syria as well. She's midway through her match with Together Project, and she's matched with some other young people. She's a first-year student at university, so she's experiencing university for the first time with the help of some volunteers, navigating, choosing classes, going around the campus, all of that. And so we're going to kind of follow her match over the 6 months to see what she was able to accomplish, what challenges arise, and how the volunteers helped her out. So these are 2 examples of how we're trying to put the focus more on to newcomers' own experiences through their own voices. And then I think what has been the most successful way of centering newcomer voices has been through the podcast we started. We started this in July of 2020. So we've put out, I think, 12 or 13 episodes. And the idea of the podcast is really to give newcomers a spot where they can talk about whatever they want to talk about. We talk about challenges in integration. We talk about social isolation. We talk about being a single mother. We talk about finding social connection, all sorts of different things. And what I like about the podcast is it's very flexible. It can be very casual conversation. It feels like you're just listening in on a conversation between 2 people. And it also can be anonymous if needed. So we do have refugee claimants in the program who want to protect their identity and don't want their name out, so we can use an alternative name. We can also not use their photo and just use a graphic image instead. So it allows us to feature people who otherwise their story wouldn't be told through a different kind of platform. And This is not only a great way for us to have storytelling about newcomers, but it's also a great way for us to share how our work is impacting the community and share it with potential volunteers, funders, and partners. And it's created a great catalog of, what our work looks like and what sort of impact we're having within the newcomer communities. And so finally, I'll just share kind of an example of a success story that's come out of centering newcomer voices. So this is all about the newcomer Sam. Sam started our program in March of 2020 at the very beginning of the pandemic. At the time, he was a refugee claimant, and now he's a protected person. He arrived as a single youth from Uganda, and we matched him with a group of university students from U of T. At the time, he was facing social isolation. He had some housing issues. He was looking for full-time work. And he also got COVID, and that was a real hurdle for him. The volunteers helped him overcome many of those things. They helped him with his resume. They talked to him about where to look for work. They helped him find a new apartment, but they also made a really close social connection. They chatted a lot about video games and movies and all that sort of stuff, and created a really great friendship. At the end of his match, we decided to feature him on our podcast, and he spoke so eloquently that he actually ended up being interviewed on CBC's Metro Morning. This led to him getting a job interview and landing a job as a cloud engineer. So this is obviously a great scenario, the best possible scenario for centering newcomer voices, but it shows what's possible when we can kind of hand over the mic and newcomers are willing to volunteer their time to share their experience, and we can hear directly from people like Sam who have been through the experience of being a newcomer in Canada. So that's all for me. I'll hand it now over to Mirna.
Thank you, Natasha. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Mirna, and I work for Costa Immigrant Services as their general manager for their stakeholder engagement. I will be, next slide. I will be talking about first to give you a brief about COSTI, and I will talk about the new challenges that emerged during the pandemic, the organizational challenges, and what worked and what didn't work. Next slide, please. So we are a community organization that works in the Greater Toronto area in 17 locations, including York Region and Peel Region. And we provide our services in 60 languages because we work with mainly newcomer communities that come from different parts of the world and speak different languages. Next slide, please. And the services that we provide range from employment to education. We have women's services, children's services, youth services, refugee services. And this is where my work comes with Together project, where I refer to them families that the government-assisted refugees and asylum seekers as well. In addition, we provide settlement services. We have services for seniors as well, and the skills training. So some of the challenges that emerged during the pandemic were mainly the questions that we didn't have answers to, like what will happen to my work permit, for example, that is expiring. Or because we work a lot with pre-arrivals as well, we were not certain about the requirements or the timelines anymore. We had also questions that we didn't have answer to in some cases in relation to CERB and other settlement services during the pandemic. And this led to some confusion. Next slide, please. But what worked well was our relationship with the funders, specifically when it comes to the IRCC and the province. So our contracts were not in a way impacted, and there was a lot of flexibility and trust between our organization and many of the funders who were flexible in us changing some of the activities, specifically doing the online ones. In addition, the RAP working group, which is a national one, also helped a lot in relation to advocacy and working on getting specifically PPE for the shelters and the reception centers where we had many newcomers that arrived prior to the pandemic, and we needed to work with them. So some of the challenges that we faced were mainly how will we be supporting our clients digitally, knowing that they don't have the access to technology. Some of them were not tech savvy, in addition to the barriers in relation to the language. So we had to come up with specific programs specifically because also we noticed that many of our women clients were preferring that they give their digital access, their technological access to their children and family members instead of them. And we noticed that these women are in a way falling through the cracks when it comes to online delivery of services. So what we did is we provided them with access to technology, specifically targeting them. We were able to give out around 60 tablets and laptops. We refurbished these and gave them to the women. We also designed a specific literacy program that targets women, and it was free of charge for the women. Through this, we helped around 120 women to improve their digital literacy during 6 to 8 weeks. But also one of the challenges we faced was in relation to mental health. And many of the clients were worried about their employment opportunities and their financial status as well. This is why we needed to reopen some of our specifically employment centers, but we had to find ways to do hybrid between face-to-face and also the using the digital ones. Also, many of the newcomers were worried about their families overseas, and we needed to give some reassurance for them. Some of what worked is that because we work when we work in the settlement sector, we work on a client-centered way. So we were able to analyze the different needs and use different modes of delivery. So we were using the phones, we were using Zoom. In some cases, we were using Teams as well. So we used the different platforms and resources that we had, which helped also target specific families. Depending on the family's needs, we were able to deliver the services. So for the families that didn't have access to technology, specifically tablets, or didn't have enough tablets, we were using phones. For others that had the technology, we were using Zoom and Teams. But I also want to stress that we were facing also some organizational challenges. Like many of our staff also were hesitant or didn't also have the skills to use Zoom and Teams. So we had to train our own staff before we started delivering the services online as well. and also the infrastructure for them. So it was very challenging times, but I think with our persistence, we were able to overcome many of these challenges. And as Natasha said, because of the resilience of the newcomers as well, we were able to help the newcomers in a way receive the services they wanted. What I want to add before I give the floor to Andrew is that what is working well is the hybrid model. Like we can't go totally online with specifically the newcomer population. So we will need to do this balance between the hybrid model and the online model. I want to add that working on the matching program, both during the pandemic online, really helped many of the families overcome many of the challenges they were facing, specifically isolation and overcoming the mental issues they were facing through connecting them with the volunteers that gave them the space and the, in a way, social opportunities to or the opportunity to interact socially with the volunteers. And I want to thank the Together project for this and for also being resilient themselves to be able to cope with the pandemic during a short period of time, actually. I think I'm done, and to you, Andrew. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. So my section is just kind of hopefully a bit of a summation of what we've already discussed, and a way to kind of look forward to how do we turn this into something that we can look at, a few years out. We've spent a lot of time talking about what happened over the course of the pandemic, and my hope and my aim is to talk a little bit about what we think things are going to look like when we go back to normal. So just kind of a quick recap in terms of these lessons that we want to take with us. So as we've heard both from everyone, really, certainly just most recently from Mirna around digital service delivery, there's a lot of convenience that we found when it comes to offering things remotely or online, but it isn't necessarily as effective, certainly when it comes to what Anna was discussing around social connections. And it does risk leaving some behind, because we've discovered these gaps in digital literacy, digital access, and that's something that we want to kind of make sure that as let's say the sector continues to move forward, we don't leave behind people who, for a variety of reasons, aren't able to keep up, for lack of a better word. To that end, also like to kind of pick up from Anna's final comments, we're seeing digital access and literacy less as a kind of a nice to have and really a need to have, the same way that it's expected that when newcomers arrive to Canada, of course, they're going to be given the opportunity to take language classes. I really don't think it's too extreme to say that very soon or hopefully imminently, that same approach will be taken to digital access and digital literacy. I mean, what we saw with e-learning in the schools, I think really kind of put a pin on that, where if we don't have access to these devices, we're literally we're fully left behind. And it's a matter of kind of finding affordable solutions and also ways of transmitting that kind of knowledge to newcomers themselves. And certainly, in these kinds of situations, we're very grateful. We had fantastic volunteers who are really offering a lot of that kind of support. But we do think that it really needs to be kind of kicked up to a more institutional level as well. Social support is going to be invaluable regardless of whether you're doing so remotely or in person. When we initially did our switch over to remote social support, there's a lot of trepidation around, is this even going to be well received? As someone mentioned earlier, how do you have TE over Zoom? So many of the bonds that were being created in our program were done through just spending time together. And we had a lot of, there were certainly plenty of challenges around that as well. But in some cases, when social isolation is actually exacerbated by this kind of, disconnection from in-person interaction, sometimes you actually need even more forms of social support. So it's less a question of, okay, well, let's wait until we can do it again, to perhaps let's explore ways that we can try doing it now that we simply hadn't thought of previously. And similarly, not to kind of put all of this burden on the newcomers in terms of finding out how they can adapt better, adaptation certainly has to arrive at organizations like Together Project or COSTI as well. For us, for example, thinking about our own skill sets as staff, so kind of wrapping our heads around what, and thinking outside of the box around what does social support look like in these kinds of crisis situations, but also long-term, how do we incorporate that moving forward? And also what we learned about our volunteers as well. So, what makes a good volunteer for in-person support isn't necessarily the same thing for what makes a good volunteer when we're talking about remote social support. And again, we shouldn't leave that as we go back to normal and we kind of go back to looking for the volunteers who are good at in-person support, but really maybe that's the kind of one of the key criteria that we can reincorporate into our program to move forward. So what will back to normal look like? There's a lot of question marks here, so I'm not Nostradamus. These are just some questions that are going to be certainly kind of driving our own program development moving forward, and hopefully they'll be useful to you as well in terms of how you're thinking about digital service delivery within your own organizations or experiences. One key question that's kind of arisen is does everyone even want to go back to kind of in-person support? So certainly we've seen a lot of strong preferences emerging. As Anna mentioned, we do have plenty of families who really just can't wait for the opportunity to go to in-person classes again. Remote English classes just really weren't a good fit for them. And it's a very, it's a challenge for them to kind of think about engaging that kind of service any differently. And those kinds of preferences we are seeing also really they're not necessarily soft preferences that can be quite hard, that actually really leads to differences in terms of the effectiveness of that program's delivery. I think maybe this is a useful time to kind of check in on our poll in terms of preferences around in-person or remote. Interestingly enough, we're seeing that 96% of individuals would prefer to do things in person and online as opposed to only online. One thing to consider about that as well is, as we've seen, there's a lot of benefits or a lot of convenience that comes with remote support. And obviously a lot of people prefer meeting in person. The challenge, however, is that if we're going back entirely to in person, there's kind of programmatic delays that might arise from that, right? So if it means that you would like to volunteer in person, but because of where you're located, for example, in the city, you might not necessarily have an opportunity to engage for several months, does that kind of change your perspective on, how willing you are to go to more of a remote model versus in person? And so this is, again, as Mirna highlighted, and certainly we're looking at it, there has to be a kind of a hybrid approach to moving forward. We've kind of crossed the Rubicon in terms of thinking about things, incorporating a more digital approach to our program delivery. Other questions: how do we address the social isolation that may result from digital service delivery models? So again, speaking to the need for kind of a hybrid approach, a lot of the service delivery that's provided by different service providers really is a means of forming social connections, especially for newcomers who have just recently arrived and they are having a difficult time kind of plugging into their host communities. So you can imagine, meeting people at your language classes, even the idea of kind of venturing out to access those services are also opportunities to engage with your local community. Obviously, things like conversation circles, other kinds of in-person programming and events. We want to make sure that those who are kind of unable to access those services are still able to have an avenue to overcome that social isolation. Touching on the point that I made in the last slide, how do we address gaps in digital literacy and access? So again, what's a better way that we can have, for example, volunteers or settlement sector staff really help newcomers learn how to use digital devices, from everything from how to pay the bills, how to access classes online, how to help their children access e-learning platforms. That's something that really should be kind of incorporated into the training. And certainly we've spent a lot of time with our volunteers learning along with them as to how they can really help. And obviously in the course of the pandemic, it was extra challenging, because how do you help someone use a digital device if you can't kind of sit next to them and look over their shoulder and help them learn? So hopefully now that we're moving into a more hybrid model, that will change as well. And I can certainly see how that might work for some organizations as well, thinking about, doing tutorials or kind of intensive classes, the kinds that Costi was offering for newcomer women. And this is especially relevant for Together Project because volunteer social support is really our bread and butter. But really, how does the community, how do volunteers, and through initiatives like Together Project, how does the community kind of engage with these settlement services as they evolve? So how do we make sure that we're keeping on top of what's changing? How do we communicate that to our volunteers? How do we empower them to transmit that information and that learning over to the newcomers, as opposed to kind of waiting for a problem to arise, waiting for a gap to emerge? How can we, again, kind of build that resiliency into our program delivery? So how does that all translate into our story? There's kind of a three-pronged kind of future outlook that I'll kind of leave off on. There's kind of three things I wanted to talk about. One is an exciting new long-term project that we're hopefully going to be kicking off soon. Also just incorporating what we've been learning about and just talking about into our regular program delivery, and also how this kind of translates into the recent influx of Afghan arrivals as well. So a very exciting project that is still in the works, so we can't name names, unfortunately, but fingers crossed we'll be launching fairly soon, is really kind of a knowledge collection project around specifically this differentiation between hybrid and remote social support, and what it means not only for volunteer engagement with newcomers, but also how maybe we can help use that kind of information around client groups, around preferences, to better inform settlement service delivery more broadly. So for these purposes, we're talking about remote as fully or almost fully online interactions. So again, regular interactions over video call services or digital messaging platforms, versus hybrid. So that component, but maybe that is more of a support role as opposed to the main bulk of interaction, which would be in person. We're going to be launching this project hopefully in 4 cities across Canada. So we're very excited to potentially be working all the way over in British Columbia for the first time, as well as a number of cities around Ontario. This is also, I think, interesting for the purpose of knowledge collection, because it helps us examine, the different geographies that kind of play into what works best where. We'll be working with a number of different settlement sector partners, as well as private sector partners. The private sector partner especially can provide interesting insight in terms of the criteria or capacities of volunteers themselves, and what does that mean for certainly this criteria of remote or hybrid, who can offer more effective or efficient volunteer support for whom. And so there's also going to be an evaluation framework built into it. This is going to be really program delivery, but certainly there's an evaluation component, because there's a lot of questions that we want to have answers that have arisen from this pandemic experience. And really, again, we want to learn what approach works best for what groups and why. So we can make assumptions on certain newcomers might have lower digital literacy skills, but also there's personality fits that come into it, language levels that factor into these kinds of matches. All of these different things, we can start to kind of parse out, what are the components of these different clients that settlement agencies are referring to us, and what does that tell us about the kind of ways that they respond to social support, and what does that tell us about how settlement services can be better delivered to them digitally or in person. And I saw someone mentioned the kind of client-centric approach that Costi and Together Project uses, and this is, in my opinion, kind of an even deeper level of that, of kind of understanding the clientele. None of this, as you can tell, has been one size fits all, and this is another level of really understanding who it is that we're working with, and how these two organizations can kind of shift our own moving parts to adapt to those needs. In terms of improving our own program delivery, so some of the things that we've kind of learned from this experience is already being reincorporated into how we just do our work. From a volunteer perspective, we've certainly leaned more into providing online resources. So whether it's a language support practice guide, we just recently this summer put out an education support practice guide. We're also excited about the prospect of perhaps incorporating more e-learning components into our volunteer training, how we prepare our volunteers. So we do our training online as well, but perhaps kind of building out different e-learning components to make it even easier for volunteers to learn about specific ways that they can support newcomers. Also, doing a better job of incorporating those digital skill sets. So when we meet new volunteers, we always try to learn about what do they bring to the table. We like to think everyone brings something to the table, but certainly there is this digital criteria as well of how comfortable are they using the internet? Are they good at teaching somebody else to use digital skills, etc. That's kind of another layer to how we're considering our volunteers for future matches as well. And also addressing, obviously, privacy risks. So we spent a lot of time this past year learning around the different risks associated with using more heavily online platforms. And we also always want to make sure that we're respecting the privacy and confidentiality of, for example, volunteer data. For newcomers, again, understanding those digital literacy and access needs. So that's kind of an ongoing process of learning about how we can do a better job of addressing those challenges, what kind of volunteer skill sets might kind of factor into the preference matching for a newcomer household with low digital literacy levels. And also learning a little bit more about how to provide them with opportunities for social connections, even if they're receiving remote social support. So what kind of, looking at the matches that we've made, what are some kind of standout factors that seem to be really working for example, newcomers who might be a bit more shy or might not be as necessarily as outgoing? How can we still provide them with social connections even on a remote platform? Finally, in terms of the Afghan arrivals, I mean, all of this kind of factors into, in general, how we've changed a lot since 2016, which is when we started. We started in response to the Syrian arrivals, and we'd like to think that this, in addition to everything else that we've learned, has really kind of helped us grow when you think of like a holistic service delivery model. So one thing to think about is that there's not only the digital component, but also thinking through everything that we've kind of taken from that experience. We initially had started with just focusing on social connections. Now we're moving in, then we moved into focusing on discrete integration priorities. And now we're really kind of further refining those to, deeper levels of understanding around personality fit, et cetera, to make that kind of adjustment that much more equitable to the newcomers that we're working with. So in this sense as well, we'd like to think that we're kind of better prepared. We have a series of wonderful partnerships in place, including Costi Immigrant Services. We have a host of new resources that are kind of ready to be delivered and put in our volunteers' hands. And we're excited to see through our kind of impact measurement how this tracks with working with this new population and whether or not, as we hope, it will have a kind of a more effective form of social support for the newcomers that are going to be that we're going to be matching probably this winter. That's the end of my presentation and the end of our workshop. While I've been presenting, I haven't been looking for any Q&A or comments, but I'm not sure if somebody else maybe on our team has.
Yeah, there's a couple there, so I can answer the ones geared towards me maybe first.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. If you don't mind just reading out the question as well.
Yeah, so I actually answered the first one, but someone, Adeli, I want to say is his name or her name, asked if the podcast is available to be listened to by other organizations, and definitely it is. We would love it if you would listen to the podcast. It's called Together Project Podcast, and if you just search that on Apple, Spotify, or Google, you should find it, and all the episodes are hosted there. We have a new one coming out later this week, so stay tuned. And Janelle asked, would you say that these podcasts are aimed at larger audiences than just in your geographical area, as in other parts of Canada? I think they are. They're actually not too focused on Toronto specific, and I'd say they really could speak to anyone's settlement journey, even outside of Canada. Like, we talk about a lot of general themes, like just experiencing socialization, isolation. I'm really struggling with that word today. Isolation, and how to learn a new language, how to overcome moving into a different job during the pandemic. So I think it really should be relatable to any audience that's interested in newcomer issues, regardless of where they are, whether that's in Canada or even outside of Canada. And then I think the other questions are maybe more for you, Andrew.
Yeah, I see them here. So Janelle says, might we change our language and thinking from back to normal to forward to normal and new better? I totally agree. And that's why I put quotation marks around back to normal. I also don't like the idea of back to normal. So I'm glad that you called me out for that. And absolutely, I don't think anyone wants to kind of get back to exactly things as they were before. But I think the idea is more around as we exit this phase that we've been kind of forced into through things like the lockdown, et cetera, and the circumstances are quote unquote the same. That's where we want to kind of think about what do we want to get back to, or what do we want to kind of look forward to. But I absolutely take your point, and I think it's a very fair one. You also asked me, could Regina and other Prairie cities communities be included in your upcoming remote hybrid delivery project? Or are you aware of any in the Prairie provinces? That's a great question. Maybe I'll turn that actually over to Anna to talk about a little bit about kind of how we think about scaling the program. But I'd certainly maybe just start by saying you should absolutely reach out to us if you'd like to learn more, and I think we'd always be open to chatting about it. Anna?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're really excited about the possibility of scaling out the Welcome Group program. We've definitely been refining and strengthening and adapting it, over the last 4 years, and we do feel like it's a replicable program. But I think part of our success in a new context has to do with the strength of our partnership with a local agency. So I think a key thing for us would just be to really start a discussion with a local agency or community members who are involved in settlement and integration as volunteers, because I think the program really needs to respond to the unique issues and challenges of a local context. And I just noticed, Janelle had another comment here about, the importance of taking the time to learn and adjust and care, for ourselves and each other in response to the pandemic. And I think that kind of cycle of adaptation and innovation is really a big part of our work, and it certainly applies to working in a new city. Because again, I think as challenges have emerged from the pandemic and as we encounter challenges in a new context, it's really about having this kind of feedback cycle where we're really able to adapt the program to respond to emergent needs.
Thanks,
Anything to add to that, Andrew or Mirna or Natasha?
Not for me. I think that was a great answer. Mirna, Natasha? Shaking heads. Okay, I'll take another question from Alice Godson. Do you face any challenges with volunteer digital literacy or access? If yes, did you have to adapt training for volunteers to take this into account? Natasha, I think absolutely you should maybe comment on this because you certainly interact with our volunteers the most. I would just say that, I mean, from my perspective, absolutely yes. And part of our training has really turned into providing some of those examples that Anna shared around what does this even look like. I think for a lot of our volunteers, there's a bit of a learning curve for them as well around the social aspect of digital literacy. I think many of them were kind of already had the equipment, but they maybe didn't know how to use it in this context. But Natasha, maybe you have some more insight.
Yeah, so I think very early in the pandemic, like the first couple months, this was more of something we'd see when people wouldn't be familiar with whatever digital platform we were using. And I spent a lot more time explaining it or navigating different platforms that worked better for different people. But I think everyone's become a lot more familiar with things like Zoom and WhatsApp. And because of that, I find this less of an issue now. In terms of adapting the training, we did kind of include sections about how to, connect remotely, like how to make this feel like as as real a connection as in person as much as possible. So one thing that I always remind my groups is that, like, when you get on a Zoom call, it doesn't need to be like, let's launch right into practicing English, let's review your resume. Like, you can also check in and be like, how's your day been going? What have you been watching on TV? And some of our groups have really gotten creative with how to connect digitally. I'm very impressed. Some groups we've seen have game nights, they've watched movies together, they've cooked things at the same time, same recipe. Two of my groups actually are doing book clubs and talking about books. So there's been new ways to adapt to doing this remotely. And I think that more than anything, we've seen the volunteers bring us a lot of new creative ideas about how to make that work.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing basically is now that we've learned how to use these platforms just to kind of, in the practical sense of here's a way that we can communicate, I think it's still taking us some time to gradually getting to the point where it's almost as natural or organic as, you know, dropping by and having tea with someone, where yes, it's ostensibly about practicing English today, but we're also going to, you know, chat, learn about each other, answer different questions, etc. So yeah, that's because there's a social component to it. That's really where the digital literacy lies, I find, for our volunteers. And the one thing maybe I'll just wrap up with is the other poll that we had, which is whether or not you volunteered online with newcomers before. 37.5, oh sorry, right as I said that, it bumped up to 40% said yes and 60% said no. And so I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say the 60% who said no should be volunteering with Together Project. So I'd encourage you to come check us out at togetherproject.ca. But thank you so much for participating in those polls and asking these questions. And again, if anyone else has any would like to discuss further, please reach out to us. Janelle just said that there's no emails there. You can email us at just Anna or Andrew or Natasha at togetherproject.ca. So it should be pretty easy to remember. Anna, Natasha, Mirna, any parting thoughts? Anything else that you wanted to share?
No, I would just say thank you for everyone that was engaging and putting things in the chat and Q&A. It makes us feel less alone talking to our screens. Yeah. And I was actually really enjoyed the communication and comments people were leaving. It was really nice.
Yeah, I would just thank everyone as well. And I think, you know, volunteer engagement with newcomers online it's relatively new, and I just think it's so important to share learning. So if there's anything that you want to share with us, or you have your own blogs or stories, we're always so eager to hear how other people have adapted and provided, you know, volunteer engagement opportunities during the pandemic. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, and I want to thanks to everyone who also participated and engaged. It was really a nice experience. Thank you all.
I just dropped our emails into the chat for anyone who's interested. But otherwise, thanks again, and yeah, take care. Have a great day.